Hi, everybody. It's Marlene with Miami Ghost Chronicles, Stories of the Supernatural. How you all doing today? And today I have a super special guest. This is a gentleman who has been involved in the field of the paranormal for quite some time. He's also written several books. His name is Jeff Dwyer, and he is the author of a series of nonfiction guides for ghost hunters. And he's also authored articles for medical journals, chapters for textbooks, novels, 150 songs, and two screenplays for television. He was born in the heart of San Francisco Bay Area and spent his early years in Alameda. He earned a bachelor's degree and two Master of Science degrees and a PhD. Fascinated with the paranormal, Jeff is an active paranormal investigator, researcher, lecturer, consultant. He's participated in various paranormal shows that are out there. How are you doing tonight, Jeff?
Great. Nice to be with you.
Likewise, likewise. Um, what I love about you is that you are one of these persons that's been involved with the paranormal for many years, long before it became quite so mainstream as it is today. Um, and there's not that many people realize that once upon a time there wasn't always digital photography and all the equipment that they've got nowadays. And I mean, the field has come quite a ways, I would say, in the last maybe 20 years or 15 years.
Yes, the evolution has been absolutely amazing in a lot of ways. It has led a lot of ghost hunters astray, however, because too many of them are quick to jump on the newest tech bandwagon and grab the
Yes.
newest thing that has come along, and sometimes spending quite a lot of money on it,
Yes.
only to find out that the device really doesn't do what it's supposed to do because it's not that sensitive to paranormal activity. It picks up a lot of natural activity in the environment. For instance, EMF meters, which a lot of people use, and you see these on the ghost shows on TV. EMF meters will indicate a signal if somebody drives by in an
Wow.
electric car 500 feet away.
Oh my God.
So if somebody is like 3 blocks from where you are, you'll get this big signal and you think, oh, there's a ghost here. Well, no, it's somebody's Tesla coming down the street. If an electric train comes by 1,500 feet away,
Wow.
the device will also emit a signal. And even less dramatic than that, nails and joist hangers and even wires with no electricity in them will create signals that some of these devices pick up. So, the evolution has given us a lot of equipment, but it has also offered a lot of opportunities to go astray in terms of what you're really picking up on your instrumentation.
Yeah. Unless you're truly, truly in the middle of nowhere. Yeah, I
Yeah.
could see where you could get a lot of false readings that and let's face it, I'm not gonna say it's impossible, but to find yourself in such a setting to do an investigation, that's not that common. You're you have too many things around you that can give you that type of reading. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And there are things that you just don't know about, too. Sometimes we go into a house to investigate, and we're unaware that somebody is in the basement working on a computer that generates a lot of electromagnetic fields. And so we're unaware of that, and we'll pick up those signals on an EMF recorder and other devices as well. But there's still been this great evolution, and I'm really happy to see it because it really
Hmm.
brings people closer to understanding that humans are spiritual beings in addition to physical beings. And
Right.
I truly believe that the spirit survives bodily death, and that's what gives us ghosts.
Right. And let me ask you something, Jeff. Obviously you're involved with this now. How did you get involved with the paranormal? Did you have an experience as a child, or what happened?
Yeah, my story is actually fairly common. I had my first paranormal experience when I was about 12 years old. I grew up on an island community in Alameda, which is in San Francisco Bay, and the island has a lot of old Victorian mansions and
Hmm.
places, and we were living in one of them. And
Okay.
I happened to see a sailor walk down the street past our house as I was gazing
Oh
out the
my
window.
God.
Yeah, and this guy looked at me and he had no eyes, and it scared me because I was just 12 years old. I was freaked
Bet.
out. And as I watched him, he continued walking past our property and just disappeared. And it was then that I realized that I could see things that we call ghosts. And
Uh-huh.
from that point on, my friends and I used to get into some of these vacant mansions, and there were quite a few of them in Alameda in those days.
Uh-huh.
And we'd walk around, and I'd hear things, see things, feel things, and that made me aware that I could pick up. I was sensitive to paranormal activity.
Right.
And I had to set that aside for many years while I pursued my education, but I got back into it, and I've been doing it now for about 25 years.
Yes.
And it preceded Ghost Adventures and Ghost Hunters and all the shows you
Exactly.
see on TV. In fact, I
Yes.
was thrilled when the show Ghost Whisperer came out because that was 2005, I believe. And
Yeah.
I thought, wow, this is great because now people are going to start seeing what I see.
Right. I mean, yeah, this was around the time also that they had that other show, Medium, that was
Yes.
supposedly also based on real life psychic. I remember that
hmm
they both came out more or less around the same time because prior to that, mostly what they had was um, little mini not even series, mini documentaries about certain haunted places and things like
Yeah.
that. And maybe they had a psychic walk in there, but that was the extent of it.
Yeah. Late in the 1990s, a show called Sightings
Yes, I remember.
was on TV, and I love that because
Hmm.
much of it was not paranormal, but they had enough paranormal stories in there to really arouse my interest. And so I love that show. I was really sad when it went off the air.
Yeah.
But yeah, we had that, and we had just occasionally, usually around Halloween,
Yes.
some network would do some documentary on paranormal activity or something like that, and that's all you had.
Yeah. Yes.
And now we have actually quite a lot on TV.
Yes, a lot. I mean, and that's the thing, and I tell everybody. I mean, don't get me wrong. I understand the concept of all the equipment is that basically they're either trying to quantify, capture some type of proof. But then I'm thinking to
Yes.
myself, uh, you could have a psychic go in there, or sensitive, and pick up on something that you can't record it. In other words, they could be having either seeing something, either visually or in their mind's eye, or feeling something, or I mean, a number of things that there's no way to produce proof. In other words, so sometimes,
Yeah.
yeah, it's sometimes I think that. Because I've seen some shows that they're like, "Oh, no, we strictly do the only with the equipment, and we lay out, yards and yards of equipment, cables and all this, and like anything except that, if it's not captured, it's like doesn't exist." And I'm like, I don't think that's
Yeah,
accurate.
there's a lot of bias in the community. There are people who are strictly techies, I call them,
Yes.
and Ghost Hunters is a good example of that. They
Hmm.
bring in 3 vans full of technical devices and lay out the cables, as you said. And some of us have talked to them about including psychics, and they're definitely against it.
Oh no, they're like,
Absolutely against it.
yes.
And yet, when you listen to them at the end of each episode, they will
Hmm.
sit down with their client and they'll say, well, we all had some personal experiences. Well, that's what it is. That's what the
Exactly.
psychic experience is. It's a personal experience of feeling something, hearing something, maybe even seeing something.
Yes.
So they claim they're not going to use psychics, but they actually admit to a psychic experience. But Ghost Adventures is a good show because they use a lot of technical devices, but they
Yes.
do include people who have
Well, I think
have
that
psychic
they've
abilities.
loosened up now. I would say in the last few years, but at the very beginning, they were more, the adventure lockdown part, and of course they had their equipment. But I think that they've loosened up where they're talking so much also not by what they're actually seeing, but also their feelings. In other words, their own sensitivity. It
Oh
plays
yeah,
in that they're their own psychics or something along those lines, and
it's
that
a,
they've used
it's a
psychics
big
as well.
it's a big part of the show. I've been on the show 4 times, and I'll tell
Okay.
you, they're keenly interested in psychic experiences, and they've featured some of my
Yes, that's
psychic
exactly what I
experiences.
mean. That they'll bring in psychics on certain shows or for certain locations. So yeah, they've realized that it's not a one size fit all kind of thing, that you could use
Hmm.
this approach for certain locations and this other approach for other locations. And don't get me wrong, I'm all for capturing evidence if that's what you can want to do. But I tell people a lot of times, because I've been doing investigations since the 1990s myself, and I tell everybody the supernatural is not an on demand thing. You could go someplace and not capture anything. That doesn't mean nothing's there. It's just that
Hmm.
maybe it's cyclical. Maybe you're there at the wrong time, on the wrong date. Uh, it could be a number of things. And then there's other times you walk in there and 15 minutes in, you're like, okay, things have happened to me sometimes. I wasn't ready to capture anything. I was just like walking around, basically,
Hmm.
and things
Yeah,
happen.
there's a couple of things that play into what you're talking about. One of them is that an individual's receptivity is largely what determines whether you can go into a place and feel something one day and not feel it the next.
Mm-hmm.
But also, it has to do with whether the ghost is really awake and transmitting
Yes.
information telepathically by producing psychic energy, which we call expressive psi.
Mm-hmm.
Most ghosts exist in a state of suspended animation,
Yes. Yes, they do.
suspended there asleep. And it's only when you wake them up and they
Yes.
become interested in you, the individual, that they'll
Mm-hmm.
transmit psychic energy to you. And that's when you hear things, feel things, and actually see
Yes.
apparitions. So there's two things that have to happen. The ghost has to transmit with a high degree of energy, and you have to have a high degree of receptivity. If either one of those is lacking, then there is no paranormal experience.
Yeah. And let me ask him, Jeff, because I've seen sometimes you do have, and this I'm talking intelligent hauntings. I'm not talking a residual or something.
Hmm. Hmm.
I've seen the ones that do want to communicate, and then there's the ones that don't want to communicate. They're aware of you, but not you. It's not. They just don't want to communicate with anybody. Like if the last thing they want to do is participate. And then there are the other ones that are like falling over themselves to manifest in some way. Sometimes they can, sometimes they can't. Sometimes there's nobody there that they can reach. So it's almost like I've seen the two versions. The ones that are trying, maybe they have a message, or maybe they're lost, whatever's going on. And then they're the ones that either because they fear they're going to be thrown out, they've got their own thing going on, and they just like kind of disappear into the woodwork.
Yeah.
Especially when there's a team or new people that come into, let's say, a house that's already occupied. All right,
Hmm.
and they kind of like, and then and I've seen that happen before. Everybody, it I've seen that sometimes it's not even as, and then like you said, sometimes you have the right people there, but uh, I've seen where some entities, they don't want to be told to leave. They might even be aware that they're dead, in other words, but they just
Well,
want to stay
yeah,
there.
there are a lot of ghosts that are where they are because they are unaware they've died.
Hmm.
And in fact, when we investigate crime scenes or accident scenes, that's principally what we run into, are ghosts that
Yes.
don't know they died. And
Yes.
they're quite confused and frightened, and they freeze up, and that's why they are still at that location of a murder or a fatal accident.
Yes.
And they're quite in shock when you start convincing them that they've actually died.
Right. And I've also heard sometimes when you have, because of course everybody always relates, like, the person that dies tragically or violently, as your usual suspects for being ghosts. But I found also that sometimes when you have somebody that dies maybe anesthetized or heavily medicated, or even sometimes, let's say, they say they had an accident, they were unconscious, and then they go to an operating room and then they die, that they kind of miss that part where they died.
Yeah.
The last thing they remember is I was okay, or they missed that part of whatever it was that happened to them, and then they
Hmm.
come to
Exactly.
that thing where they're self-aware, in other words, um, but nobody basically communicates with them or acknowledges them, and then that's when
Hmm.
they do the what happened. They totally missed the whole part where they died, and sometimes I know that they, because we always hear about that thing, especially with those near-death experiences where you have the family member, the friend, or somebody come to get you and the white light and all of that. But in some cases, I've heard, especially when that entity is still self-aware. In other words, they know something's going on, but they don't know they're dead. And let's say if they have, let's say, grandma come to get them, which they know is dead, they're like, "You're
Hmm.
dead. I'm not going with you. I'm alive." They still
Yeah,
have a problem with the
quite.
acceptance part. So
They're
yeah,
quite freaked out about that.
yeah,
Yeah, and those ghosts become really erratic when
yes,
they finally get that realization.
yes,
It's really
yes.
sometimes difficult to deal with them, and sometimes kind of sad too, because their devastation at realizing they're dead really can spill over, and people who are empathic will
Hmm.
pick up that and get quite upset. I've been to investigations where people in our team have simply broken down because they picked up that devastating emotional experience of realizing that the body's dead,
Right.
because to many people it represents a closed door. You're not going back to that
Hmm.
life you've known, and that's pretty tough to take.
Sure, especially if one of two things, you die unexpectedly, or two, you die violently. Let's say somebody does something to you,
Hmm.
and you feel like, hey, I does anybody know what happened, or that this person killed me, or that whatever the case might be. And I find that stuff that's a very strong emotional anchor for a human soul, where your ego is still there. In other words,
Hmm.
yeah, you still want to work it out, like you said, and you can't come quite to grips with there's no revolving door on this. So I guess that's when they get stuck in that in between place, um, which is, and from what I understand, even the nicest person, let's say, and let's say you die, you can become very frustrated. In other words, it brings out also the worst in human nature in it when you're caught in that in between place where um, I was alive and now I'm dead. I think I'm not sure. Somebody tell me what to do. Why can't anybody see me? I need to tell them that I left my will under the, whatever it is, because
Yeah,
and a lot of
yeah.
people, I tell them, you know what? We are the center of each of our own universes. We're the most important person there. And what we think of individually as important, super important, maybe to another person, you're thinking you'd get stuck for that. But I'm thinking, yeah, it's for some people, especially if they left something hanging. Yeah, it is important to them, really important. Uh, and their perceptions are reality, just like it is for all of us. And
Hmm.
that's a host of a variety of reasons why sometimes spirits get anchored here. Have you had? Do you do anything as far? Because I know, like you said, obviously you see them. As far as when you tell them, do you know you're dead? Do they? Have you ever had any that you've been able to cross over, or what's your experience with that?
Well, I've been with other investigators who have done the crossover
Mm-hmm.
ritual,
Okay.
but I have some feelings about that, because I think it's rather presumptuous to kind of push a spirit over, crossing over, whatever that means. That
Okay.
barrier usually is interpreted as a one-way street. You go cross over it, and you're not
Right.
coming back.
Right.
And there are spirits who are on this plane who may actually have some authentic good business to do, and they
Oh,
need to look
sure.
over something. And I think it's a little presumptuous to go into a place and identify a spirit and say, "Oh, you're stuck here. I got to push you
Oh,
over.
no, no, no,
I
no,
got to
no,
move."
no.
Yeah, so I think that's not a good thing to do. I think it's best to try to get to know the spirit and find out if it's truly lost and wants to
Right.
move
Right.
on, or if it's there for a good reason.
Right. Or that, like, which is usually some, what I think of is the ones that just are not quite sure that they're dead. They know they're confused, and sometimes they're angry, and they just want somebody to tell them what happened. Like, yeah. And I think that helps a lot because um and but no, absolutely not. You can't. I think that even after death, we still have our a free choice, as
Yes,
to what we're going to do. Yes.
exactly, exactly. I agree completely with you. Yes. So, people who are really enthusiastic about going in and crossing over spirits, I really try to slow that down a little bit and just don't be so presumptuous as to think that that's really what the spirit wants.
No, they
Yeah.
sometimes they do it on their own. I found sometimes that if if you have that ability and you kind of communicate and kind of say, yeah, you're dead, they figure it out later on when they're ready
Hmm.
to go. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
you
They
know, when
will.
you
Sure.
go away and you think about it and you go, oh, so that's why, or whatever, then just come to terms with
Yeah.
it and move on.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And I know that in, like you said, out there in that area where you're from, like there's a lot. As a matter of fact, I read about a year ago that there was a house out in San Francisco that apparently when they started doing some renovations, the garage, they came up, they found a child's coffin. It turns out that I guess there's a lot of cemeteries that they were
Oh
supposed
yeah.
to move, but they didn't quite.
This
Didn't
is one of the things that makes San Francisco one of the most haunted places I've ever been to, and I live
really.
close to it. Um, in in 1902, San Francisco had a plague epidemic. A lot of people don't know that, but the
Okay.
plague that struck Europe in the Middle Ages struck San Francisco in 1902.
Really?
Yeah, and it was devastating.
I did not
And
know
the
that.
graveyards filled up really fast, and there were about 35 graveyards in San Francisco.
Right.
Many of them dated from the gold rush days
Right,
when, you
exactly.
had two or three guys died and they just kind of buried them outside the saloon,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
basically. So by 1902, there were 35 cemeteries, and the city fathers were very afraid that if you buried a corpse, that it could still infect the living people around it. So they said, we got to move all the cemeteries out of San Francisco. And they did that. They moved them down to the peninsula about 20 miles south, a place called Colma.
Right. Yes, that's what I
However,
heard.
there were three official cemeteries left behind. The military cemetery in the Presidio was left there, of course,
Mm-hmm.
and the Mission Dolores Cemetery, which dated from 1778. It's a small cemetery, really small, but the graves there were left untouched. And then a third place called the Neptune Columbarium, which opened in 1896, and it holds the ashes of about 7,800 people. So
Really?
those were left there, but the
Okay.
other 32 were moved, and they would pick up the headstones and move them down to Colma and put them in the ground, and they would leave the coffins behind in San Francisco.
Right. It
And they would just
described something where they had like a system which was very haphazard as to, oh, we have a coffin here, and they took some up, but they left a bunch
yeah,
behind.
they left a bunch, and they collected their paycheck
Yeah.
for doing a quarter of the work they were supposed to do. So what you'll do these days is, as you said, people will, renovate a house, put in a swimming pool, open up a basement or something, and find, guess what, a coffin.
Oh,
And that's actually happened all around the Bay Area here.
wow.
And most recently, the incident you're referring to was they found a cast iron coffin with a little
Yes.
girl in it,
That one. That was
and she
incredible.
looked just like she died yesterday.
Yes, because it was airtight. Yes, it was like it's
It was
incredible.
airtight, plus the iron provided the proper environment to prevent oxidation of the body.
Mm-hmm.
And it was beautiful, beautiful little girl. She died when I think 4, 5, 6 years old, and she was
Right.
buried with a rose, and the rose was actually intact as well.
That's incredible. When you looked at that, you look at, she even has like, she looks like a doll. She looks like if she's asleep. It's
Yeah,
incredible how,
yeah, and there's a lot of places in the Bay Area. There's down in Los Gatos that same kind of thing's been found. There was a little boy found about 1990 when the sewer was rebuilt.
really,
Um, Yeah, and they found him. And the interesting thing about that is he died about 1915 or something like that, and his
Okay.
sister was still alive.
Well, did you hear the one the which I think was really neat? The little girl, they um they they took a hair follicle, and
Hmm.
about a year later they were able to they went back on the old maps of the cemetery when it was originally there, and they kind of like basically it, got down to a few families, and they were able to find one family who they thought it was, and they were able to match her by DNA. And they got her real name,
Hmm.
and I think it was her great grandnephew or something, who was still alive, and they were able to do a perfect match. And I thought that's spectacular. Of course, the wonders of
Yeah,
DNA, but
yeah. Her name was Edith, and she
yes,
was almost 3 years old.
yes, and
Yeah, 1876 she died. Yeah, so this is not an uncommon experience. This has happened actually up in Seattle as well, and it's really exciting to see that.
hmm
And you wonder where her spirit has been all this time, because there is a place in San Francisco. The neighborhood surrounding the Neptune Columbarium was once one of the largest cemeteries in San Francisco,
okay,
called Lone Mountain Cemetery. That's where this coffin was found. But people around that whole neighborhood have told me that they experienced paranormal activity in their homes. And I said, well, have you ever dug under your home or had an occasion to do that for whatever
uh-huh.
reason? They haven't. But I said, if chances are you've got a couple coffins under your home and
Yeah,
you don't really
can
know
you
it.
imagine?
And that kind of freaks them out a little
I
bit.
bet it does. I bet it does. It's like, do we really want to renovate? Let me think about that first.
Yeah. There was
Well,
a place in
and from what
There
I
was a place
understand,
in New Orleans where the same thing happened not too long ago. Somebody was building a swimming pool and they found 17 coffins.
right, and I heard about, I want to say maybe like a year ago, also in Philadelphia, in the part what they call the Old City, which is the older part of the of Philadelphia. The same thing. Um, they had they had buildings there before, but they had demolished the buildings and they were going to put a high rise. So I guess they dug in and they found a cemetery from the 1700s, who supposedly was moved right after the Civil War. But surprise, it wasn't moved. Same thing. They were
Yeah.
supposed to move the coffins to a new cemetery that was way out further from the city.
Mhm.
And of course, expediency and cost. That
Yeah.
was so they had built other buildings since after the Civil War there, but those had been demolished and they were putting in a high rise, and that's when they found all these coffins. So you're right,
Yeah.
that's more common than people think as far as that poltergeist
Mhm.
moment. You moved the gravestones,
Exactly.
but you left the coffins or whatever behind. Yeah.
Sure. One of the things I do when I investigate haunted places is I go and look at the history of the land, and
Mm-hmm.
very often I find that there were things that went on there that suggest there may be graves underneath. When I grew up in Alameda, there was a street called Mound Street, and I was curious about why they called it Mound Street, because it didn't look like it went up a mountain of any sort.
Okay.
But what we have learned since is all around the Bay Area, in many places, 30 or 40 locations, there were mounds created by Indians when they
Oh
lived
my
here.
God.
And they created these mounds full of shells and other debris from their villages, but they also buried their dead in these mounds.
Oh my
And
God.
so Mound Street was a place where they had discovered Indian remains. And as a kid, when I was 14 or 15, I went to the local museum and saw a lot of displays of remains found on Mound Street in Alameda. And it wasn't long after that that some of my friends who lived in that area started telling me stories about weird things that went on in their homes.
And you're like, I
And
know
that's when I
why.
realized that their homes are built on top of Indian burial
Can you
grounds, and that's
imagine?
probably why.
Wow. And it's
Yeah.
like most people, they just take it for granted. Oh, that's the name of the street, and that's what it is, whatever. Or it was a
Yeah.
mountain, whatever. People don't, not many people do exactly what you did, Jeff, which is to
Hmm.
find out. There's got to be something here going on as to. Well, they had over here in Florida. We have this big lake in the middle of the state called Lake Okeechobee, and especially
Hmm.
at the turn of the century, a lot of it was there was a lot of bass fishing and the commercial fishing. I mean, people go out there for sport, but a lot of and catfish. And the fishermen out there, when they threw out their nets, they said that they would bring in skulls. It looked like a pumpkin patch. Okay,
Ah, wow.
and originally they were thinking they were trying to date it, as far as when the settlers, and I believe that the last time they tested one of them, it looks possibly like I mean, it predates even the actual Native Americans that are here in this area. It looks like an older tribe, and they're guessing that they looked at the lake as a like a portal. In other words, you disposed of your dead in the
Hmm.
lake is what they're guessing, because even that tribe, they either leave or they just become other tribes. So there's nobody alive, in other words, and there's no written record. But yeah, they sometimes it's unusual. So that yeah, we have a lot of different reports along the lakeshore of hauntings, and I'm sure some of it is tied into that of
Oh, yeah.
the Native American, because this is where they apparently thousands. This was where they would put their dead. Uh,
Hmm.
and I tell people, well, it's the same thing. Also, you hear about all these out in Europe, those bog people and stuff. Places like that
Yes.
were often looked at as the in between, like the doorway between this world and the next. So,
Oh, yeah. And, the spirits don't have a clock. So, you think of, well, how could there be a ghost there if the guy died,
hmm
600 years ago? Well, it's easy because they don't have a time function in the spirit world. They could have
right,
died 600 or 700 years ago, and then now they're in your bedroom
right. And then we're thinking,
because
huh? And I can
your house is built there.
and let me ask him, because Jeff, let me tell you something. I'm totally surprised by what you said, because basically what you're talking about is what the bubonic plague is, what you were saying that hit San Francisco.
Yeah.
That's
Hmm.
it. What do you think that was, because it was a port city and it was brought in by a ship, or what do you
Yeah.
think? Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, they've traced it back to the ship that
Oh,
brought it
really?
in, and they think the rats came off the ship and started
Oh.
infesting people on the waterfront, and it spread very quickly.
Yeah, yeah, because of that.
Uh,
Rat of all things, my God. You find that all
yeah,
over the place.
yeah. A lot of people who live in the Bay Area are clearly unaware that there was a plague here at one time.
I had never heard of that. I mean,
Yeah,
you always hear of, back then that, yeah, well, there was TB and they had the Spanish influenza and all that stuff, but I had never heard of that.
yeah.
That
It's
is so
quite something.
interesting.
Killed quite a few people.
Oh, I'm sure. I
Yeah.
mean, especially that's the thing, that some of these diseases and these illnesses, they kill you very quickly, in other words. There's a very short incubation period and then you're dead quick. Or if there's,
Yeah, and there's no IV fluids given, and no antibiotics, no
hmm
antivirals, no nothing to support the person nutritionally. So a lot of them just died. Yeah.
Let me ask some, Jeff, because I know a lot of people ask me this a lot. They think that of why well, let me ask you, put it this way. Do you think cemeteries are haunted or not?
Cemeteries are not nearly as haunted as people like to think.
Okay.
People think that, oh, you go there, it's loaded with ghosts. The ghosts that are there are usually ghosts of people who actually worked at the cemetery, like grave diggers
Mm-hmm.
or undertakers. But also, the few ghosts that are there are those in whom the grave's been destroyed by environmental processes like a hurricane or something like that, or vandalism, or they may be in the wrong grave and the headstone is wrong, or something
Okay.
along that line. But usually, if there's a ghost there, that's the reason why.
Okay.
However, there's a lot of paranormal activity in graveyards, and what these are residuals, and a lot of it is imprints, emotional imprints left on the environment by family members who visited the grave
Right.
for sometimes many decades and poured out their emotions.
Sure.
And when we're alive, we all create these imprints.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can imagine a graveyard filled with granite,
Wow.
which is going to pick up these imprints and record them and keep them for decades. So when you go into a graveyard, you're going to pick up light anomalies, you're going to pick up cold
Yes.
cells, sounds, EVP, even other things like that that make people think they're experiencing a ghost, but in fact they're picking up a residual.
And you know why? The reason why I asked you is because I go along and I know what you mean. You're thinking, okay, if this person's buried, in a cemetery, yeah, you might have. But the other day, who was it that was discussing that they were talking about a family? As a matter of fact, they wrote a book about it. The lady wrote a book about it. Who they're originally from Texas, and their dad died. I want to say it's Chicago. I believe it was Chicago, and
Hmm.
they decided years after their dad died that they wanted to bring him home. In other words, rebury him down in, I guess, the family plot down in Texas.
Hmm.
And they went up to Chicago, and apparently it's one of these, Chicago being an old city was one of these. I don't know exactly which cemetery it is, but it was one of the bigger, older cemeteries, which there's a million graves. And number one, they had a really hard time locating him. Um, they were told that because that they couldn't even roll in there one of those like a digger to go in there. They had to do it by hand to make a long. Finally, come to find out when they start digging up where their data. Finally, they told them after they ran around and they had to basically do the research themselves where it was that he was. They had found basically his plot, but where he was
He's back boiling
buried,
water and cooking stuff.
they find out they're digging that that's not where he was. They found somebody else, in other words. Okay,
Yeah,
and it
an
became like
old wrong grave.
wrong graves that especially in some of these older cemeteries, that's more common
Yeah.
than most people think. Uh,
Oh, it is. Because sometimes floods, hurricanes, tornadoes rip through a cemetery, and after it's gone, people go in there and try to replace the headstones, and they get them in the wrong spot.
right, and it
They just set them
makes
up wherever they think they're supposed to go and hope for the best.
right, and then, and sometimes it makes me wonder, and I understand, if that's something like that happens, where hey, sometimes everybody thinks of like nobody has, to put it bluntly, time for the dead. you know,
Hmm.
these are strangers that are basically taking care of you, but um, you have a lot of. It almost sounded like when they started investigating. That's why I'm saying she even wrote the book about it. That apparently was really common. It wasn't just, oh, we had the bad luck that it was our father's grave that wasn't really where it was supposed to be, and things like that. And it makes me wonder sometimes if that's also some when and and sometimes you think about it, you say, well, once you're dead and let's say you leave and you really don't need your body, for all you know you might not even care what happens to your body because you're enlightened and you realize I don't need a body anymore. But then I'm thinking,
Hmm.
well, what if you're one of these people, especially maybe not so much modern times, where your religious beliefs, even if you want, and by this I don't mean you have to be hardcore religious, but people, you know don't realize that the burials, that long time ago, people, it really mattered to them to be buried in consecrated ground. That this was what you wanted for your remains. People really cared about that. Nowadays, cremation's more accepted, but back then people cared about, like, are you going to bury me in hallowed ground? Am I going to get last, some clergyman to officiate over my burial? All those things, where if you're still
Hmm.
around at some
Oh, yeah.
point and this doesn't happen, you like, I'm not leaving. Hey, what happened to my? This was important to people. I don't think a lot of people
Yeah,
realize that.
there's a lot of enculturation that goes into people's thoughts about dying and care of your remains afterwards. And so, as you said years ago, people really cared about that quite a bit. And that's why you go to these cemeteries and you see really ornate tombstones um,
Right.
and other monuments. And these days, not so much. People are content to be dumped in the ocean, and that's it,
Yeah.
or just placed on a hillside. That's it. So that's the difference.
Right. It's not just as important as it used to be, as far as I mean, you even heard
Hmm.
of some people when they were almost, I want to say, when they were young, they were already, if you had some type of money, you were preparing the family vault or a big memorial, and this is where the whole family was going to get buried. And even when people were
Yeah.
young, it wasn't that they were old and sickly. They were preparing for this sometimes long before they ever died.
Oh yeah, yeah. Your niche was in reserve for you amongst all the family ancestors.
And Jeff, I wanted to ask you. I saw that
Hmm.
you did, which is great. That basically you have your books are like a ghost hunter's guide to
Hmm.
different cities. And
Yeah, that's the Ghost Hunter series. It's published by Pelican Publishing of New Orleans, and it's currently 9 books. And
hmm
they focus on a specific geographic region like Seattle, Portland, New Orleans, Southern California, San Francisco Bay Area, wine country, and gold rush country, so forth. And then
okay,
I have some textbooks also. I have 3 textbooks available on Amazon.com about
okay,
paranormal investigation. One of them focuses on crime scene investigation, which is really
really?
fascinating.
Wow, I
Yeah,
think that is so
that's my.
interesting.
Oh yeah, paranormal CSI is really cool stuff. It can be a little hazardous for a lot of reasons, but yeah, it's really cool to go to a place very soon after a
hmm
murder or something like that. It's amazing what sensitive people can pick up.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, one time I did an interview with a girl. She was living in North Dakota, but at one point down up in northern Florida, she was a coroner. You know, the ones that go in there and just give basically reason for death. And
Hmm.
you know, a lot of times they're called into pretty ugly uh, scenarios. You know, sometimes people have been. Then I asked her, I said, hey, did you ever go someplace where you got a weird feeling versus others? I guess. I mean, besides what you were looking at.
Yeah.
And she says that a couple of times, yeah, she did go to certain places where it's almost like she felt like this person is there watching. Yeah, especially where the bodies have been undiscovered for like a few days, and then finally they become aware, and of course they go in there. It didn't even necessarily have to be a violent or a murder or anything. It was just that some people sometimes, especially if they're not in touch with that many people, days could go by before anybody discovers that they've passed away. And she said, yeah, I kind
Hmm.
of felt sometimes like that person was there watching. Yeah, but she says I didn't really try to think about that because if not, you're not there for that. You're there just to do your job, and you've got police and other people
Sure.
around you, just to make sure
Hmm.
there's no foul play involved. But yeah, I think that criminal, and like you said, even sometimes as time goes by, especially if something violent happened at that location, I imagine that it has to leave some type of imprint depending
Oh
on what
yeah.
happened.
There's a lot of imprints, and some psychic detectives use those to figure out clues to the perpetrator, because sometimes they'll actually get a vision of the person's appearance, or sometimes they'll pick up odd things about their behavior, either a tone of voice, an accent, or even a sound of them walking on pavement in a way that suggests they have a limp or
Mm-hmm.
an abnormal gait. And psychic detectives have used these things as means to identify the perpetrator. Yeah, so going to crime scenes is really interesting stuff. It's a little hazardous. You have to be careful
Right, depends on where you go.
because you never know if the guy who did the crime is still hanging around to see who's snooping around
Sure.
looking for clues. And then people in the neighborhood are usually very sensitive after a crime, of course,
Yes.
and they object to somebody who's gone in there looking like they're in for the thrill
Yes.
of just poking around. So you have to be a little cautious and respectful and not too ostentatious about what you're doing.
Right. No.
But crime scene investigation is really an interesting way to approach the paranormal.
I think so. I think so. I mean, um, people don't realize that things like that when they happen. I mean, it's basically sometimes it's very apparent what happened, but sometimes there's layers under upon layers as far as how this ended up happening. In other words, how this crime ended up occurring.
Hmm.
Uh,
Oh yeah, and sometimes we can pick up clues as to whether the victim knew the assailant.
hmm
That's something that the police always try to establish, and sometimes with great difficulty. But a psychic may pick that up very quickly if they can pick up EVP of casual conversation, even an amicable conversation that kind of went bad, something
Right.
like that. So a lot of lot of police departments, FBI, DEA, others use psychics. They don't admit to it,
Yes.
but they do use them.
Yeah, they do, and a lot of yeah. I mean, I understand it. Believe me, because locally, and I'm not going to get into it. I know that they're very very private, and sometimes they won't even contact you directly. They'll have a person go. In other words, have a third party contact a sensitive or a psychic
Yeah.
just to get their impression. Yeah.
Yeah, because if key evidence turns up, you can't take that into court of law and say, well, the psychic told us where the
Exactly.
weapon was buried. Because
Exactly.
right away, most juries will just dismiss that.
Yeah,
So,
no, that the
and so
defense attorney is going to jump all
you
over it
know,
and tell it.
a lot of district attorneys won't admit to it, but that's really what's going on.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Let
Hmm.
me ask something, Jeff. As time has gone by, because you told me that story about that sailor, that must have been like such an eye opener when you were 12 years old, especially
It
the
really
no
was.
eye part. That's like,
It freaked
what?
me out because I'd seen a lot of sailors around town, and because it's a Navy town,
Uh huh.
and this guy didn't look like any of the people I have been seeing. He looked like his clothes were really old, dirty, tattered clothing, and he had a big bag slung over his shoulder, which they call a sea
Uh
bag.
huh.
And in the old days, a sailor could have only one bag up aboard a ship, and all your worldly possessions were in that. And like I said, he had no eyes, and that's what really freaked me
Did
out.
he look solid? I mean, it sounds like he looked
Oh
pretty
yeah,
solid until he just looked at you and it's like, oh,
he looked completely lifelike until he started fading away as he continued walking across down the street in front of our property.
Jeff, let me ask something. As time has gone by, have you gotten more sensitive? Have you been able to fine tune it? Or do you do, I remember like that part in The Sixth Sense at the very end where the little boy, the lady's gotten hit by the bicycle on her bicycle,
Hmm.
and all of a sudden he's seeing her there. Do you ever find yourself
Yeah,
in those scenarios where all of a sudden you're just doing your thing and
yeah.
you see something or somebody?
I do that actually fairly often. I'll see things. I work in a hospital, and I see
Oh,
that
oh my
a lot in the
God.
hospital. I'll see people who I know who died, and they show up. Yeah, I do run into that. I'm just kind of open to it all the time, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
and experience it at the most inopportune times sometimes. But yeah, that's what happens to me.
Jeff, do they key in that you're able to see them, or is it just?
Yeah, I actually had a conversation with one fellow named Charlie not long ago. A fellow who I know died, and I was walking out the front of our hospital, and I saw him walking towards the hospital, and I was astounded. But I said, "Charlie, what are you doing here?" And he said his wife's going to have surgery. And I said, "That's why you're here." He said, "Yeah, yeah." And he just, walked past me and walked towards the main entrance of the hospital. And as I watched him, he just faded away. So he was coming back to be with his wife while she had surgery.
Wow.
Yeah,
See,
and he looked completely lifelike. And when I spoke to him, and then he just started fading away.
that is incredible. Yeah, it's almost
Yeah,
like there's so much around us that's unseen. And I tell people, sometimes people think that the ghost or the undead or whatever you want to call them. I don't want to use undead. That sounds like a zombie, but ghosts or discarnates are only present like if you go to a so-called haunted house or haunted location. And I tell them there's a lot. Most of them are not bound to a certain house.
yeah.
They're all around us all
They
the
can
time.
be they can be anywhere,
Yeah.
literally anywhere.
I think that
Hmm.
sometimes we don't see them as much because we pulling our hair out. I don't think we could carry on our normal
Hmm.
lives if we were seeing people that had passed away all the time, like we
Sure.
do other people. But
Well,
they're
most people go through the day with a low degree of receptivity. In fact, a lot of empaths try to shut down their receptivity so they can get through a day without interacting with 20 different spirits. And so most of us do just unconsciously shut down our receptivity so we can wander around places and really not see anything. But if
yes.
you open
I think a lot of people also, that's why also you have what they call those crisis apparitions, the ones that, especially when it's like a family member or death, when somebody's just passed away, that they'll see that family member.
Hmm.
I think those are the people
Yeah.
that they do shut it down, but it's just this one time. It's like it's too overwhelming, or that person that's passed away really wants to just say like a goodbye, that
Hmm.
they have no choice but to see
Yeah.
it.
The goodbye experience is fairly common. People experience that, often during the funeral, or when all relatives gather at the house afterwards.
Yes.
It's I've heard from so many people that they've gone off to go to the bathroom or something,
Hmm.
and while they had a moment alone, and they got kind of quiet, they would hear the voice of the deceased, or even see the person. So that's always weird. And when I've been to very few funerals in the last several years, but I always look around for the deceased.
Standing in the crowd.
Yeah,
I believe it. I
definitely.
believe it. I
Hmm.
believe it. What is it? That thing about, I'm gonna pretend yeah, I wish I could attend my own funeral. And I'm thinking to myself, people, if only people knew that more than likely
most
the person's there.
most people probably do attend their own funeral. Yeah.
Yeah, they see who's there, who didn't show up, who's really sorry about it, or who's gossiping. Because,
Hmm.
there's a lot of weird conversations that go on at funerals.
Definitely.
So, Jeff, thank you so much for spending this time. It has been fantastic. Um, like I said, I enjoy talking to somebody who's been doing paranormal research long before it became, I want to say, mainstream, um, because it's come a long way. It's a lot of it's just different as far as what's happened. I want to say in the last few years. Like I say, everybody, I remember when I
Hmm.
was a kid, the most you had was books from Hans Holzer.
Oh
That's what was
yeah,
out there.
yeah. I've got one of his books, I think,
Yeah.
somewhere.
Uh,
Yeah. Well, it'd be great. Thanks very much for all this time. And if you direct your readers or listeners
yes,
to my website, it'll be great.
absolutely. There's a link. I've been showing slides of some of your books that you have out there. And of course, absolutely, there's going to
Hmm.
be a link to your website. So if
Hmm.
anybody wants to get a hold of you, or also if they want to purchase any of your books, absolutely. But thank you so
Sure.
much. I truly appreciate it. Take care.
Oh, wonderful. And we'll talk again sometime.
Absolutely. Bye bye.
Okay. Great. All right. Good night.
Good night. So, guys, what did you think? Come on. I think it was great. But you know I am. You know how I am about these things. I always think it's great. Again, you know, guys, I interview a lot of people. You know I do. I interview a lot of people. And I interview a lot of authors slash paranormal investigators. And I always say the same thing when I talk to somebody who's been doing this as long as he has, because I understand it, because I came from that. I've been doing it, actual investigations, since the 90s. And before that, of course, I was involved in it. It's just people don't realize, especially if you're a little bit younger, that back then, especially, if you really were into it, besides reading a book, people looked at you like, huh? And I was like, what? And I really enjoy talking to somebody who's gone through that transition of the last 20 or 25 years, okay, where the most you got was, like he said, that show sightings, or around Halloween time, of course, that everybody did some type of docu series, whatever little thing, the ghosts in the castles in England, or some of the things here. Like a lot of them were like in the Northeast, like New York, which were traditionally haunted locations, but not like it is now. Not like it is now. Uh, and you know what? He made a very good point about how the good part of it, and I've said this before, that paranormal investigations or research become so mainstream, which is fantastic, because now you don't get those looks like you're into what. Uh, but the flip side is that some people want to play by hard and fast rules when it comes to documenting paranormal occurrences, and you can't do that. And I've said it. I'm the first one. I believe in science. I believe if you've got something that you can use to capture it, whether it's a digital record, whatever, And that's very, by the way, that was really interesting what he said at the beginning about the EMF. Okay, a lot of people, because they see it on the show, they go off and they purchase the piece of equipment, sometimes pay a lot of money for it, and don't really do the research as to what are the false positive readings you can get from this piece of equipment. What are the things around it that are going to give you some type of feedback? And it's anything but a ghost. So, uh, that was really interesting. But I think it has to be a combination. Photography, video, uh, anything. But there's other things. There's the psychic or the sensitive. I ask a lot of the groups I interview, do you have a sensitive on your group? Some of them double as sensitives. Uh, dowsing rods. I mean, there's a lot of things that you can, because if sometimes I've been on countless investigations where the equipment and the sensitive all go off either at the same time or one before, right after, even if they're in different parts of a house or a location where they don't see each other. Okay? I've been doing investigations where I'm saying something's going on and all of a sudden things go off. Like, and that, there's no way to explain that except, we, the humans, we are equipment too. Our feelings, uh, you know, what we capture, how we feel, especially if you have somebody that's a little bit has some experience in the field, okay, and they know how to interpret their own bodies. Okay, that when that when I feel this certain thing, this is what this means, or whatever. Everybody's, we're all individuals, and we all process information or feelings or however it's coming into you different ways. But when you get somebody that understands themselves pretty much and what it means, a person like that can be invaluable. And then you get your equipment or whatever to kind of like validate it. Because like in everything, you want more than one source, especially if you've got two. So I think that's, and that thing that he said about the bubonic plague in San Francisco, I had never heard of that. What an eye opener. Can you imagine living out in a place where you never know if, like he said, you want to put a swimming pool in your backyard? It's like cross your fingers and hope you don't dig up a few coffins. It's going to be so disturbing. Interesting but disturbing, of course, when you're a paranormal researcher, that's like, yay! But yeah, I've heard of that. I have heard of that. Like we were talking about that case of that little girl's coffin, and they said that that's quite common and that even people in the neighborhood know it, and then that you'll get whole neighborhoods who have some range of stuff going on, and it's kind of understood because many people, if they don't exactly know, they suspect that that whole neighborhood is sitting on what used to be a cemetery. It's not that they don't know that it used to be a cemetery, is that they all kind of know that there's a lot of coffins that were left behind and not moved to the new location. So yes, that's that poltergeist reference. Nobody believed that back in the 80s. That's very, very common, more so than people think. So anyway, guys, please hit the like button, subscribe to my channel. I'm asking my true believers again to send me in your videos, your MP3 files, anything that however you want to communicate with me, and tell me your ghost story, your encounter with the unknown, you saw Bigfoot run across the road in front of you, whatever. You had a premonition of a dream, and I'm here. I want to hear it. I want to hear it. I want to hear it. If you want to email it to me, do it at marlene@miamighostchronicles.com. But again, I prefer that you video yourself with your phone. Like I said, if not, if you want to record yourself and send me an MP3 file, and I'll somehow include in one of my shows. I would love to hear it because it's incredible for all the shows that we see with all these scary locations and people's firsthand accounts. To me, the things I've heard, it's incredible. The experiences that are like really hair-raising that people have had. So I would love to share that. Like I said, if you want to say, look, Marlene, use only my first name, that's fine with me. Or don't use my name, or make up a name. That's fine with me too. It doesn't matter. So please Don't forget about that. Also, remember, uh, uh, podcasts of this show, they're available usually within 72 hours after the show is released on iTunes, on Spreaker, on iHeartRadio, on SoundCloud. You can also go to MiamiGhostChronicles.com and you can download, you can either listen to it or download the MP3 file of the podcast if you'd like to do that. So, again, guys, thank you so very, very much for coming back, watching all the shows, and of course, listening to everything. Thank you so very much. I really appreciate it.